In the year 1905, photography was not the casual, everyday act it is today. It was an event. To pose for a camera meant preparing with care, dressing in your best clothes, and standing as still as stone while the photographer worked his complicated equipment. For many families, a photograph was a once-in-a-lifetime memory, something that might be passed down for generations as proof that they existed and endured. The Carver family, living in the heartland of Illinois, was no different. They were simple farmers working long hours in the fields, raising their children with discipline, faith, and the hope that their lives would be better tomorrow than they were today. Their home was nothing extravagant, just a wooden farmhouse built by John Carver's own hands. Yet when the traveling photographer came through town that summer, Margaret Carver, John's wife, insisted that their family should have a portrait. On the day of the photograph, the family dressed in their Sunday best. John wore a freshly pressed shirt and suspenders. Margaret tied her hair into a neat bun and wore her only good dress, a dark fabric trimmed with lace. Their children, 2 boys and their youngest daughter, Clara, lined up in front of them. There was nervous laughter, a reminder to stand straight, and then silence as the photographer raised the heavy wooden camera, draped in a black cloth. What that camera captured was more than an image. It was a declaration. In an era when sickness, poverty, and loss visited nearly every household, a photograph was a bold statement that said, "We were here, we endured, we belonged to each other." When the plate was finally developed, the Carvers were frozen in time. John stood tall, his jaw set in determination. Margaret's eyes held both softness and quiet strength. The children, restless though they were, looked directly at the lens with a mix of curiosity and innocence. The smallest, little Clara, wore a faint smile that softened the otherwise serious portrait. For years afterward, that photograph hung proudly in their home. It was shown to visitors, displayed at church gatherings, and even used as a reminder of what perseverance looked like in their small farming community. Neighbors admired it. Children in the town would whisper about how perfect. The Carvers seemed as if their smiles reflected a family untouched by hardship. But photographs, no matter how timeless, are only fragments of the truth. They capture a moment but cannot reveal the full story that surrounds it. The smiles, the straightened collars, the proud stances, these were performances for history, carefully constructed to leave a legacy of dignity. What the photograph did not reveal was the hardship of endless winters, the long days of backbreaking farm work, the quiet griefs that every family of that time carried but rarely spoke aloud. Still, the Carvers believed the picture meant something greater. For them, it wasn't just about what people saw, it was about hope. A single photograph could outlive a lifetime. While they knew that fields failed, barns burned, and life was unpredictable, they also believed that an image preserved meant that their family's love and determination would remain, even if the years erased everything else. And they were right. More than a century later, long after the family had passed on, and their farmhouse had been left to rot, that very photograph was rediscovered. When historians unearthed the glass plate negatives in the attic of the abandoned house in 2024, they found not just a relic, but a message from the past. What they saw was both ordinary and extraordinary, a family smiling bravely into history. It was ordinary in the sense that thousands of families across America posed in similar ways, but it was extraordinary because of what it represented, the universal desire to be remembered. In that moment, frozen on glass, the Carvers were not so different from us. Today, we take photographs with phones, filling albums with thousands of images that often feel disposable. Yet, when stripped of technology and time, the essence is the same: the human urge to capture love, belonging, and resilience in a single frame. The Carvers could not have known that their image would resurface 119 years later. They could not have known that people in another century, living in a world of technology and convenience, would stare at their faces and wonder who they were. And yet, perhaps deep inside, they understood. Perhaps when Margaret straightened her children's collars that day, she whispered to herself, "One day, someone will remember us. This is why photographs matter." Not because they show perfection, but because they testify to the fact that we lived, we tried, we loved. The Carver's portrait reminds us of something essential. Every moment we capture carries within it the weight of eternity. Behind every smile is a story untold, and when those stories resurface generations later, they don't just show us history, they teach us how to live today. So, what do we learn from that photograph of 1905? We learn that life is fleeting but legacy endures. We learn that even the simplest families in the humblest of homes can leave behind something powerful enough to outlast them. And we learn that behind every frozen smile is not perfection, but the courage to hope in the face of life's hardships. The carvers may not have known the impact their photograph would have, but they left us a reminder that still resonates. Every moment matters, because every moment could be the one that history remembers. When we look at an old photograph, our eyes often go first to the faces. They are the windows through which the past still looks back at us. In the Carver family photograph of 1905, each face seemed to tell its own story, yet all were bound together by a single frame. At first glance, they appeared content, united, and strong, a family proud of who they were. But when historians studied the photo over a century later, they realized that the expressions carried more weight than simple smiles. John Carver, the father, stood at the back of the group with his broad shoulders squared and his jaw set firmly. At first, his face appeared stern, even intimidating, as though he were the rock of the family, the one who held everything together. But look closer, his eyes revealed exhaustion. They carried the burden of too many long days in the fields, too many nights worrying about how to keep food on the table, and too many losses endured in silence. His smile was not one of joy, but of duty. He smiled not because life was easy, but because he needed his children to believe it could get better. Beside him was Margaret, the mother. Her face was softer, though framed by the lines of weariness even at her young age. The corners of her mouth were slightly upturned, but her smile was not carefree. It was deliberate. She knew this photograph might be the only one of their family ever taken, and she wanted it to capture hope, even if her own heart carried quiet grief. In her eyes, historians noted something almost haunting, the look of a woman who had buried 2 children before the age of 30, a woman who knew that every day with her family was fragile and precious. Her smile was not for herself, it was for the children who still stood beside her. Then there were the boys, Samuel and Henry. Samuel, the elder, stood stiffly as though trying to imitate his father's seriousness. He wanted to look older than his years, to prove himself capable, though his eyes betrayed nervousness. Henry, the younger of the 2, couldn't quite hide his mischievous spirit. Even as he tried to remain still for the photograph, the corners of his lips twitched with suppressed laughter. But behind that innocence was the reality of a boy growing up in a world where childhood ended far too soon. In just a few years, Samuel and Henry would be old enough to take on adult labor in the fields, facing responsibilities their small shoulders were hardly ready to carry. And then there was Clara, the youngest. She was the one who drew the most attention in the photograph, the one whose faint smile softened the entire scene. Clara's small frame, dressed neatly in her little white dress, radiated innocence. Her smile, unlike the others, seemed almost natural, almost untainted by hardship. Yet, tragically, she was also the one whose fate would later cast the darkest shadow on the family's story. At the time of the photograph, Clara was only 5 years old, her whole life ahead of her. But within 2 winters, she would be taken by an outbreak of scarlet fever that swept through the countryside. The photograph, therefore, became not only a family portrait, but the last image of Clara alive. Her smile, once a simple detail in the photograph, became a haunting reminder for generations. To her parents and brothers, that smile represented both the joy of her short life and the pain of her absence. To historians, it symbolized the fragility of existence, the way a moment of happiness can be frozen forever even when sorrow follows quickly behind. When modern historians examined the photograph in 2024, they didn't just see a smiling family from 1905. They saw layers of truth beneath the expressions. They saw a father masking hardship with strength, a mother fighting grief with dignity, children caught between innocence and responsibility, and a little girl whose smile would become immortalized in tragedy. The smiles were not simple. They were shields, performances, and testaments all at once. But here lies the powerful lesson. Even though the photograph hid pain, it also revealed something greater: the determination to choose hope in the face of struggle. The carvers did not smile because life was perfect. They smiled because they believed it was worth fighting for. Their expressions were an act of defiance against hardship, proof that even in the darkest times, families could stand together and declare, "We will not be broken." Think about it. How often do we do the same today? We smile for photographs at weddings, birthdays, and reunions, not because everything in our lives is perfect, but because we want to capture the best of ourselves. We want to remember the joy, not the pain. The carvers remind us that a smile is not always about happiness. It can also be about resilience, about refusing to let life's trials steal the little moments of beauty we can preserve. When we look into the faces of the Carver family today, we are reminded that behind every smile in every old photograph lies a story untold. Some stories are joyful, some are heartbreaking, but all are deeply human. The Carvers teach us that the smiles we wear, the ones we capture, and the ones we leave behind can inspire future generations long after we are gone. So the next time you look at a photograph, whether it's one from your family album or a relic from history, look deeper. Don't just see the smiles. Ask yourself, what battles did they fight? What pain did they carry? What hope were they trying to preserve? Because in every face, there is a truth hidden behind the smile, and sometimes that truth is more powerful than words. For the Carvers, their photograph became more than a memory. It became a legacy, a reminder that even when life is hard, we can still choose to face the camera, stand tall, and smile. Not because life is perfect, but because life is worth remembering. For more than a century, the Carver family home in Virginia stood quietly at the edge of town. By the 21st century, the house was nothing more than a fragile skeleton of wood and stone, weathered by storms and forgotten by most who passed it. The windows had long since lost their glass, replaced by shards and shadows. Dust gathered in every corner, and the floorboards groaned with each step, as though remembering the footsteps of those who once lived there. It was in this house, during a restoration effort in 2024, that workers stumbled upon something that would shake not only the town, but also the understanding of the Carver legacy. While clearing debris from the upper rooms, one of the men noticed a small, crooked panel in the attic wall. It didn't look like much, just a warped piece of wood nailed awkwardly in place. But behind it was a hollow space, a cavity untouched for more than a century. Inside, they discovered a dust-covered wooden box no bigger than a suitcase, bound with a rusted latch. The box looked ordinary at first glance, but the moment it was lifted, everyone felt its weight, both physically and emotionally. It wasn't just wood and dust they were holding, it was history waiting to be unsealed. When the latch finally broke open, the air seemed to change. It was as if the room itself held its breath. Inside lay a carefully arranged collection of belongings, each piece whispering a story from the past. At the very top was a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. The ink had browned with age, but the words were still legible. These letters, historians later discovered, were written by Margaret Carver, the mother in the photograph. Some were addressed to relatives far away, others were never sent at all. They spoke of loneliness, of fear during sickness, of prayers whispered in the night. She wrote of Clara's laughter echoing through the small farmhouse, of Samuel and Henry's growing strength, of John's burdens as a father trying to hold everything together. One line from her letters gripped the historians with chilling force. If this house ever stands empty, may those who find these words know that we smiled not because we were free of sorrow, but because we hoped our children's children might live lighter lives. Beneath the letters was a small doll hand, sewn from scraps of cloth. Its button eyes were loose, and its stuffing was leaking from one side, but it was unmistakably Clara's. This was her doll, the very one she clutched in family stories, the very one she had played with during the long winters. The discovery of this doll made the photograph from 1905 even more haunting. In the picture, Clara had stood with that faint smile, her small hands folded in front of her. To think that this doll had been tucked away, preserved all those years, gave an almost unbearable weight to her memory. It was no longer just a photograph. It was touchable proof of her short life. Deeper inside the box lay a black journal, its leather cracked with age. This belonged to John Carver. His words painted a portrait of a man far different from the stern figure in the photograph. He confessed to nights of drinking to dull his pain, to arguments with Margaret about money, to the crushing guilt of not being able to save his daughter from scarlet fever. His entries revealed a truth most photographs could never show. Behind his strong jawline and steady stare was a man wrestling with helplessness. One entry, written only weeks after Clara's death, read, "They tell me time heals all wounds, but they do not know a father's wound. Each morning I walk into the fields and I see your shadow running through the tall grass. Each evening I return to a silence that mocks me. The photograph shows it." Smiling, but God knows that day was already filled with tears we refused to show. Perhaps the most unsettling object at the bottom of the box was a lock of golden hair tied with string. It was small, far too small to have belonged to anyone but Clara. Some historians believe Margaret placed it there as a keepsake, a way of holding on to her daughter long after she was gone. To see such an intimate, fragile token survive more than a century shook even the most seasoned researchers. The box was not just a collection of objects. It was a time capsule of pain, resilience, and humanity. Each item revealed what the photograph alone could not. The smiles were not lies, but shields. They were fragile masks protecting hearts weighed down by sorrow. What makes this discovery haunting is not simply the tragedy of the Carver family, but the way it mirrors so many of our own lives. How many of us tuck away our pain in hidden places, letters never sent, journals never read, small tokens of people we've lost. The Carvers remind us that even when history forgets, the truth lingers in quiet corners, waiting to be rediscovered. The forgotten attic box forces us to see that history is not made only of wars and leaders, but of ordinary families who lived, loved, and lost. Their smiles, preserved in photographs, were only part of the story. The box tells the rest, and here lies the lesson for us today. What will we leave behind for those who come after us? Will our photographs and smiles tell only half the truth? Or will we leave behind words, tokens, and legacies that reveal the depth of our humanity? The Carvers, without knowing it, left behind a message across generations. You may suffer, you may lose, you may hide your pain behind a smile, but you are not forgotten. Their box, hidden in the attic for 119 years, was proof that even when the world moves on, the human spirit endures. So the next time you walk into an attic, open an old drawer, or stumble upon a forgotten box, remember this: what you find may not just be dust and relics. It may be the echo of a life once lived, a smile once carried, and a truth that still demands to be heard. For decades, the 1905 family photograph sat silently in its frame, a relic of another era. At first glance, it was nothing more than a typical portrait of the early 20th century. The father in his wool suit, the mother in a modest dress with lace trim, the children lined neatly in front with shy expressions. The sepia tones gave it the warmth of memory, a frozen moment of smiles and civility. But when historians began to examine it in detail in 2024, the truth they uncovered left the entire town shaken, and cast an eerie shadow over what people thought they knew about the past. It started with a graduate student named Rachel Mayer, who was cataloging old family photographs donated to the county archives. Her job was straightforward: scan, document, and preserve. Yet when she placed the 1905 photograph under high-resolution equipment, something struck her immediately. Behind the smiling family, in the shadows of the parlor wall, there appeared to be faint outlines, faces. Not painted portraits, not shadows from light, but distinct human faces, pale and blurred, as though pressed against glass. At first, she thought it might be damage to the film or smudges caused by age, but as she zoomed in closer, she realized the figures had eyes, hollow, sunken eyes staring directly into the camera lens. Rachel initially dismissed it as a trick of light, the kind of illusion that old photographs often produce, but she flagged it anyway for further inspection. When a team of image analysts ran enhancement scans, the results were chilling. The photograph contained at least 3 hidden figures in the background, faces of children, none of whom were identified as members of the family. These were not random patterns. The clarity was undeniable: small noses, thin lips, and even strands of hair visible against the glass reflection. What made the discovery horrifying was not just the presence of the unknown figures, but the historical context that surrounded them. Through archival research, historians unearthed records about the family pictured, the Thompsons. They had been a prominent farming family in the area. On the surface, they were respected in town, often described as devout, hardworking, and generous. But buried in the census reports and medical records was a chilling detail. The Thompsons had reported only 4 children alive in 1905, yet earlier census data hinted at the existence of 3 other children, none of whom appeared in later records. There were no death certificates, no burial plots, no obituaries. It was as though those children had been erased from history. As whispers grew, so did suspicions. Had the hidden faces in the photograph been the missing children? Were they captured in some eerie accident of time, or had something far darker occurred in that household? The townsfolk had always spoken in hushed tones about the Thompson property. Older generations recalled strange stories, cries heard late at night from the barn, children who were never allowed to play in public, and neighbors who insisted something was off about the family's cheerful exterior. The discovery of the hidden faces in the photograph reignited those old suspicions. Suddenly, the smiles in the image looked forced, almost as if they masked a terrible secret. Further investigation led researchers to the Thompson attic. There, inside a locked chest that had not been opened in nearly a century, they found disturbing artifacts: tiny shoes with initials carved inside, faded children's drawings that abruptly stopped mid-scene, and letters from the mother written in frantic, almost desperate handwriting. One letter read, "They say we mustn't speak of them, but I still hear their steps at night. I fear the walls remember." The chilling implication was unavoidable. Something had happened to those children, and the family photograph, intended as a keepsake of happiness, had inadvertently preserved their presence forever. For historians, this discovery was more than just a dark mystery. It was a reminder of how appearances can deceive. The Thompson family, pillars of society, had projected the perfect image of prosperity and unity. Yet behind the smiles, behind the lace dresses and polished shoes, something was deeply wrong. Their tragedy, or perhaps their guilt, was immortalized not in records, but in a photograph meant to portray innocence. But the horrifying discovery carried another layer of meaning. It taught people to look beyond the surface, to recognize that history is rarely what it seems. Families, communities, even entire nations often choose to smile for the camera, presenting their best selves while hiding the shadows in the background. And just as those hidden faces eventually came to light, so too do hidden truths always eventually emerge. The town held vigils after the findings were published. Some saw the discovery as evidence of injustice that had long been ignored. Others saw it as a haunting but necessary reminder: secrets can't stay buried forever. The truth, no matter how horrifying, will one day demand to be seen, and for modern readers and historians the lesson was sobering. We live in an age of curated images where people post perfect smiles on social media, showing only what they want the world to see. But the story of the Thompsons reminds us that real life is never flawless. Pain, struggle, and hidden battles exist behind even the brightest smiles. The horrifying discovery wasn't just about a family in 1905. It was about all of us today, learning to acknowledge the shadows and deal honestly with them. When we look back at the eerie photograph from 1905 and the horrifying truths it revealed more than a century later, it is easy to dismiss it as just a mystery of the past, a tragedy that belonged to another time, another world. But if we stop there, we miss the most important part of the story. Because this haunting discovery is not only about the Thompson family, it is about us. It is about the masks we wear, the secrets we bury, and the silent battles hidden behind smiles in our own age. Think for a moment about what the photograph represented. On the surface, it was a picture. Perfect family, carefully dressed, neatly posed, smiling just as society expected them to. Yet behind the smiles, there was loss, silence, and perhaps even guilt. Now, look around at the world we live in today. We too are surrounded by photographs, only now they are instant, countless, and broadcast on social media for the world to see. Every day, people post carefully chosen snapshots of their lives, vacations, celebrations, smiling faces. But how many of those images hide the shadows just outside the frame? How many smiles conceal exhaustion, loneliness, depression, or even fear? The message of the 1905 photograph is startlingly clear. Appearances can be deceiving. We cannot know the full truth of someone's life by the image they present. And while that realization may be uncomfortable, it is also freeing, because it reminds us that we do not need to compare ourselves to the polished illusions of others. That family who looked so perfect on paper and in a photograph carried secrets darker than anyone could imagine. Likewise, the people we see today, smiling in pictures, projecting happiness, may be carrying burdens we know nothing about. Another message for us today is the inevitability of truth. For decades, the Thompson family's secrets were hidden, but eventually evidence surfaced and the story was revealed. That is the way truth works. Whether it takes months, years, or generations, truth has a way of surfacing. In our own lives, this should encourage us to stop running from what is real. It is far better to confront pain, acknowledge mistakes, and seek healing than to lock everything in a metaphorical attic box and hope no one ever opens it. Because, as history shows us, the box always gets opened. There is also a message of compassion here. Imagine those children's hidden faces appearing behind the family, staring silently from the photograph. They remind us that so many people, both then and now, live unseen. Their stories are silenced, ignored, or erased, and yet they are still here, waiting to be remembered. In our world today, we meet people every day who feel invisible. They may sit in our classrooms, work beside us in the office, or walk past us in the grocery store. Their struggles go unnoticed because they wear a practiced smile. But if the photograph teaches us anything, it is to look closer, to listen, to care enough to notice when someone's eyes are silently asking for help. The horrifying discovery also carries a warning about the dangers of silence. In the Thompson family's case, neighbors had suspicions, whispers circulated, but no one asked hard questions. No one dared to confront what might have been happening in that house. And so the truth remained buried for more than a century. How many times in our own communities do we choose silence because the truth feels too heavy, too inconvenient? How often do we see signs of suffering in a family member, a friend, or even a stranger, but look away because it is easier not to get involved? The photograph reminds us that silence can become complicity. Choosing not to see does not erase reality, it only allows the shadows to grow darker, but beyond the warnings, the story also carries hope. When the photograph was rediscovered and examined, the forgotten children were remembered. Their existence, once erased, was acknowledged. Though late, justice of memory was served. This is a reminder that healing is always possible. Even after decades of silence, truth can be honored. In our own lives, this means it is never too late to speak the truth, to reconcile, to face what we have avoided. It is never too late to begin again. Most importantly, the photograph speaks to the value of honesty in our relationships and communities today. We do not need to live in fear of what others might think if they see our flaws. We do not need to hide behind forced smiles, because real strength, real connection comes from authenticity. It comes from saying, "Here is who I really am," and allowing others to do the same. If the Thompson family had been able to confront their pain openly instead of hiding it, perhaps their story would have ended differently. Perhaps those missing children would have had their voices heard. So when we look at that photograph today, we should not only shudder at the hidden faces, we should also take a deep breath and ask ourselves, what am I hiding? What am I pretending does not exist? And who in my life might be hiding their pain behind a smile, waiting for someone to notice? The message for us today is clear. Do not be fooled by appearances. Do not run from the truth. Do not let silence erase the voices of those who deserve to be remembered. And above all, let us live lives that are honest and compassionate, not staged for the camera, but rooted in real love, real connection, and real courage. Because if history has taught us anything, it is this: photographs fade, smiles fade, but truth endures. And the truth, no matter how frightening, has the power to set us free.